Welcome, friends. The storm outside is fierce tonight, the thunder cracking like a warning. But here, within these words, I have a story, a gift for you, a gift that will guide you through the dark, calm your mind, and help you drift off to sleep. Despite the storm's roar, just remember, the rain might be scary, but you're safe here. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell, so you never miss the next tale. Now close your eyes and let's begin. Mark Reynolds had been driving trucks for over a decade, and he'd seen it all. Long nights, rough weather, bad roads, and even worse drivers. But nothing, not even the most terrifying stretches of highway, had ever prepared him for what he would encounter on this trip. It was supposed to be an ordinary haul, a cross-country route, nothing out of the ordinary. He'd picked up a load of industrial supplies from the warehouse in New Jersey and was heading west toward the small town of Westwood. He had driven this route hundreds of times before. The roads were familiar, the small towns dotting the highway like lifeless sentinels, always the same. But tonight felt different. The air had a thickness to it, and the highway seemed emptier than usual. The hum of the engine was the only sound, a constant reminder of how alone he was. Even the usual radio chatter felt distant tonight, just static and the occasional cryptic voice from a long-forgotten station. Mark shook his head and focused on the road ahead. Just another night, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. Nothing strange, just get to Westwood. The road stretched out in front of him, the headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the endless stretch of asphalt. But after hours of driving, Mark noticed something odd. The signs for the towns, the markers on the highway, seemed to blur. He couldn't remember passing the sign for the next town over. He was sure he had. He glanced at the GPS. The red dot indicating his position was where it should have been. But the town names on the screen weren't matching up. Damn GPS, Mark muttered, tapping the screen. Must be malfunctioning or something. But it wasn't just the GPS. The highway signs were also starting to blur. Either that, or he hadn't noticed them before. A new sign appeared in the distance, one he didn't remember ever seeing. Welcome to Silver Hollow. He frowned. Silver Hollow. Mark had driven this route for years, and he had never heard of Silver Hollow. It wasn't even on the map he had in the truck's cabin. With a quick glance at the clock, he realized that he'd been driving for nearly 5 hours without stopping. He shouldn't have made it this far without a break. He turned onto the exit ramp toward Silver Hollow, figuring he'd find a place to pull over, get a drink, maybe stretch his legs. Something felt off about the town. Empty, eerie. There wasn't a single car in sight, not even on the streets. And then, as he drove through the quiet streets, Mark's headlights flickered. First once, then again. A low, ominous thrum seemed to vibrate through the truck. It's just the alternator, he told himself, gripping the wheel tighter. Just an old rig, but something wasn't right. The town felt wrong. The streetlights were dim, barely glowing, casting long, unnatural shadows on the cracked sidewalks. The buildings were old, run down, and the silence was suffocating. It was too quiet, no movement, no signs of life, like a town stuck in time. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the end of the street. A person just standing still in the middle of the road, staring at him. Their face was obscured by the fog, but their stance was unnerving, motionless, like a statue. The headlights of his truck illuminated them for a moment, and for just a heartbeat, Mark could swear he saw something unnatural about the figure's eyes. Dark, hollow. He slammed his foot on the brake. The truck screeched to a halt, just in front of the figure. Mark's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he just stared at the person standing there. "Hey," Mark called out, his voice rough. "You okay?" No response. His pulse quickened as he put the truck in park. The figure didn't move. They just stared. "Hey," Mark repeated, this time opening the door of the truck and stepping out onto the cracked pavement. The fog seemed to thicken, and the air grew colder. His breath fogged in the air. "Can you hear me?" Mark asked again, taking a cautious step forward. But the figure didn't answer. It just stood there, motionless, staring at him. Mark hesitated. There was something deeply unsettling about this. The stillness, the cold. This wasn't right. The figure started to move, slowly, mechanically. Its arms raised to its sides, stiff as though they had never moved before. And then the thing, whatever it was, took one slow, deliberate step forward, and Mark ran. He jumped back into the truck, slammed the door shut, and gunned the engine. He didn't even care to look back as he floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck rattled as he sped down the street, looking ahead at the empty, deserted town. The sound of his engine echoed through the streets, but there was no sign of life, not even the figure. He glanced in the mirror, trying to slow his racing heart. But then he saw it. The figure was standing in the same spot where he had last seen it, watching him. And then a message flashed on the truck's GPS screen. "You have arrived." But there was no destination, no town, no place to be found. The road stretched on, and the eerie feeling of being watched continued to gnaw at Mark's thoughts. The rain's still pouring, and that thunder's really something, huh? But don't let it distract you. Let's keep going with the story. And hey, before we dive deeper, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. You wouldn't want to miss what comes next, right? Mark's hands were still gripping the steering wheel as he sped down the empty road. The unsettling image of the figure still burned into his mind. The truck's headlights sliced through the thick fog, but no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The town, Silver Hollow, was just wrong. The eerie quiet, the figure standing in the middle of the road, watching him. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following him. But there was nothing. No one. The streets behind him were empty. "Get it together, Mark," he muttered, trying to calm himself. "You're just overthinking. It's an abandoned town. Someone must have been messing with you. Maybe it's some kind of prank." His fingers drummed nervously on the wheel, but even as he tried to rationalize it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching him ever since he pulled into Silver Hollow. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, but that sense of being followed, being watched, stayed with him. As he passed through the town's narrow streets again, a few things started to catch his eye. Strange things, pieces of broken glass glittering on the sidewalk, discarded objects that seemed out of place, as though someone had just dropped them in haste. There was a car parked under a tree, with its headlights still on, but there was no one in it. The windows were cracked, and dust covered everything. And then he saw it again. The figure, it was standing at the same spot on the corner of the street, where he had first seen it, now closer. Its face was still hidden by the fog, but this time, Mark could see that it wasn't just standing there, it was moving toward him, slow, deliberate, like it was following him. The hair on the back of Mark's neck stood up. He slammed his foot down on the gas pedal, the truck surging forward, but as he sped past, he couldn't stop himself from looking back into the rearview mirror. The figure was still there, standing in the exact spot where he had left it, except now there was something different. Its head was turned toward him, and Mark could feel its eyes burning through the fog, right through him, like it was reaching into his soul. He pushed the truck faster, his heart racing in his chest. The sound of the engine roared in his ears, but there was no escape. The road stretched on, empty and lifeless. The GPS flickered. A red dot appeared on the map, marking his location. But there was something wrong with the map now. It was showing a different route, a detour that he hadn't planned. The path didn't match any of the roads he had been on before. The roads, the town, the place, it all felt out of place, like something was changing, shifting beneath his feet. He squinted at the screen, but before he could make sense of it, his truck jolted. The headlights dimmed, and the engine sputtered, coughing as though it was about to die. "What the hell?" Mark shouted, his hands jerking on the wheel, trying to keep the truck from skidding. The gas pedal didn't respond, and he could feel the truck slowing. The truck shuddered again. This time, the entire cab vibrated with a strange hum. Mark slammed his fist against the dashboard in frustration, but then something else caught his eye. A figure, the same figure. It was standing in the middle of the road now, directly in front of him. Mark's stomach dropped. His foot froze on the brake, and his mind raced with panic. He tried to steer, but the truck didn't respond. It was like the road had taken control of him. He couldn't escape. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, still staring at him through the fog. "No, no, no," Mark yelled, yanking the wheel in desperation. "Move, move." But no matter how hard he tried, the truck wasn't stopping. The figure was getting closer, the darkness around it growing thicker, as the truck lurched forward, unwilling to stop, until, crash, the world tilted. Mark's vision went black for a moment, the force of the impact throwing him forward against the steering wheel. His chest hit the seatbelt, and a sharp pain shot through him. His head spun, and he groaned, trying to shake the dizziness away. When he opened his eyes, the figure was gone. The road was empty. No one was standing in front of him. No sign of the crash. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the blood there, but when his hand pulled away, he noticed something that made his stomach twist with dread. The truck wasn't damaged. The truck hadn't hit anything. It was as if the crash hadn't even happened. The road was still there, stretching endlessly in front of him. The fog was thicker than ever, swirling like it was alive. The truck was moving again, the engine purring softly, as though nothing had happened. Mark looked around, confused, his mind racing to make sense of what was going on. The GPS flickered again. The red dot on the map blinked. But now, it wasn't showing a route. It was showing nothing. There was no destination, no signs of life. Just the road, the endless road. The radio crackled again. "You're lost, Mark." Mark gasped, his pulse quickening. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly, his knuckles white. "What the hell do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The voice came through again, louder now. "You were never meant to leave Silver Hollow." The truck surged forward, faster now, as if it was being pulled. And that's when Mark realized he wasn't driving. The road had him. "Hey, it's still pouring outside, and the thunder's not letting up, huh? But don't worry, we're safe here, wrapped up in this story. So, let's keep going." Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened, until his fingers were numb. The truck was accelerating on its own, the engine roaring beneath him, as if the road itself had taken control of the vehicle. The fog around him thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns, pressing in from all sides. Every time he glanced at the rearview mirror, It was as if the world was changing behind him. The houses, the streetlights, the buildings, everything was blurring, like a distortion in a dream. No matter how fast he drove, no matter which direction he went, the road always led back to the same place. Silver Hollow. His pulse quickened, and his breath became shallow as panic set in. He slammed on the brakes, but the truck didn't slow. It just kept moving, faster, as if being pulled by some invisible force. The fog growing thicker, the darkness pressing closer. "Stop! Stop! Damn it!" Mark shouted, desperately jerking the wheel to the side. But the truck didn't respond. It was like driving through a thick, suffocating fog that was swallowing him whole. And then suddenly, the headlights cut through the mist. A figure stood at the side of the road, just up ahead. A person, standing still, in the middle of the highway, waiting. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He tried to swerve, but the truck wouldn't listen. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at him through the fog. Mark gritted his teeth, swerving again, but the truck seemed to turn with him. He had no control. The figure didn't move. It was like it was waiting for him. And as the truck barreled toward it, Mark's blood ran cold. He felt a deep, primal sense of dread flooding his chest. He couldn't stop. He couldn't escape. The truck was closing in fast. "No!" Mark screamed, his foot pressing the brake as hard as it could go. But there was no slowing down. It was as if the road was controlling him now, as if the truck were just another part of the nightmare that had consumed him. And then, just as he thought he would crash into the figure, the road suddenly opened up, shifting, and the truck veered sharply to the right, away from the figure, onto a completely different path. The figure disappeared from sight, swallowed up by the mist. Mark was left gasping for breath, his body trembling with fear. He didn't know what to think anymore. What was happening? Why couldn't he stop? He glanced at the GPS again. The screen blinked, and the red dot marking his location flickered as though it was malfunctioning. Route recalculating. The map showed nothing now. No roads, no towns, nothing. Just an endless stretch of darkness and fog. The truck hummed along the new path, faster than before. Mark slammed the wheel left and right, trying to gain control, but it was pointless. He was trapped in this nightmare, caught on a road that had no end, no beginning. Suddenly, a low, rumbling growl filled the air. It wasn't coming from the truck, it was coming from behind him. Mark dared a glance in the rear-view mirror. There in the distance, just outside the beam of his headlights, two sets of headlights appeared. Another truck. But it wasn't just any truck. The engine roared louder, and the truck started to close in. Mark's heart pounded harder. His pulse raced as the figure of the truck grew larger, faster, moving toward him with unnerving speed. It wasn't just chasing him, it was hunting him. "Get off the road," Mark shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Let me out of here." But the truck behind him wasn't slowing down. It wasn't stopping. And then the voice came again, clear, calm, in his mind, as though it had always been there. "You can't leave. You never leave the road. You are already ours." The truck behind him honked, a deafening, hollow sound that rattled the very bones of the vehicle. Mark swerved again, but the truck kept pace. It was too close now, the headlights blinding, the sound of the engine, a constant roar in his ears. And then it happened. The truck pulled alongside him, its presence suffocating. The figure in the driver's seat was motionless, staring straight ahead, its face a shadow, its eyes dark and empty. Mark could see its reflection in the mirror, and in that moment he realized it wasn't just one truck anymore, it was several. The fog parted, just enough for him to see the endless line of trucks, all identical, all following him. They were closing in from all sides now, surrounding him like a pack of hungry wolves. And then, in a sudden flash, the trucks disappeared, just like that, gone. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the fog slowly began to dissipate, revealing a straight road ahead. The trucks had vanished, but the fear, the dread had not. It was still there, gnawing at him. The headlights of his truck flickered once again. The engine sputtered, and Mark realized, with a sickening certainty, that he was no longer driving. The road was, the trucks were still there, just waiting for him to return, and there was no place left to go. "You will always drive," the voice whispered. "You will always be on the road." Mark slammed the wheel in frustration, tears blurring his vision. His foot pressed the gas, and the truck sped forward into the darkness. The road stretched on forever, and the only thing Mark could hear was the low, constant hum of the engine. He had no choice. He was part of it now. Mark's hands were slick with sweat, his grip on the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. The truck roared down the road, the fog swirling around him, but the oppressive silence had returned. No more trucks, no more figures, just the endless highway stretching out in front of him. The eerie calm wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. He had driven for hours, but time felt meaningless. The truck had a life of its own now, moving without his input. The headlights flickered again, casting long shadows on the empty road, and Mark realized something he had tried to deny for far too long. He was trapped. The road was controlling him. He wasn't in charge anymore. The trucks, the figures, everything had been part of it. The road was the thing that had him. The road stretched out before him in an endless line of black asphalt, with no sign of civilization, no town, no exit, just fog, just empty space. He tried to fight it, to regain control, but every time he turned the wheel, the truck corrected itself. Every time he pressed on the gas pedal, the truck responded faster, pulling him further into the dark abyss of the highway. Mark's heart raced as the thought struck him again, clearer than ever before. The road wasn't just a place, it was a trap, designed to keep him here, to keep him driving. He slammed his hand against the dashboard in frustration, trying to make sense of the nightmare he was in. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself. "This can't be real." The truck's engine let out a low growl, as if in response. Mark's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The fog seemed to swirl in on itself, but this time something was different. Something moved in the mist. A shadow. It was faint at first, like a distant silhouette, but it grew bigger, closer, faster. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he realized what it was. A truck. Another truck. But this one wasn't just following him. It was waiting for him. The headlights cut through the fog, glaring like eyes watching him, tracking his every move. Mark's pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out across his back. "No," Mark whispered, his voice shaking. "Not again. Not this. Not again." He floored the gas, trying to outrun it. But the truck behind him matched every move. It didn't just follow him, it mirrored him, moving with an unnatural precision, always just behind him, never gaining, never falling back. The fog seemed to part for the truck, allowing it to move with terrifying speed. Mark's hands were trembling now, his vision narrowing as he tried to push the truck faster. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead as his heart raced in his chest. The fear was back, that overwhelming fear that he couldn't escape. The road wouldn't let him escape. The truck in the rearview mirror was getting closer, too close. It was almost on him now, its headlights gleaming like the eyes of a predator. And then the voice came again, crackling through the static of the radio. "You can't run from this." The words echoed in his mind. He could feel them, the weight of them, as they sank into him, gnawing at his sanity. He slammed his fist against the wheel, tears stinging his eyes. I'm not going to let you win." The truck behind him didn't slow down. It didn't even flinch. It just stayed there, getting closer, the headlights flickering like they were coming from the depths of hell. "I'm not part of you," Mark shouted, his voice cracking, but there was no one there to hear him, no one to answer. The truck was right behind him now, so close that Mark could almost feel its breath on the back of his neck. The road was narrow now, winding, twisting, as though it had no end. The truck moved with him, every turn, every swerve, like it was part of him, part of the road. Then it happened. The figure in the truck appeared in his rear-view mirror. It was him, Mark's own face, staring back at him from the other truck, his own expression twisted in a horrifying smile. His eyes were hollow, blackened, as if they had been drained of all life. Mark's breath hitched. He couldn't breathe. His hands went numb. He tried to look away, but it was like his eyes were locked on the reflection. He was paralyzed, trapped in that moment, the truck and the figure and the road closing in on him. And then the voice came again, not from the radio this time, but from the figure, from himself. "You can't leave. You were never meant to leave." Mark screamed, his voice breaking, as the truck sped forward, faster and faster, the road twisting around him like a serpent. The truck behind him mimicked every turn, every movement. It was a part of him. He realized in that moment what had happened. He was the one chasing himself. He was the one that had been driving the road all along. The figure in the rear-view mirror leaned forward, its hollow eyes never leaving him. It grinned, and for the first time, Mark understood. It was never about the truck. It was about him. The truck ahead of him, the truck behind him, they were both the same. It was all him. The road had taken him, swallowed him whole, and now there was no way out. The fog closed in again, thick and suffocating, and Mark's truck accelerated into the darkness, pulled by the force of the road, into an endless loop. And in the distance, the figure watched, silent, still, waiting. Mark's mind felt like it was splintering. The truck surged forward into the dark, its engine roaring as if it were alive, as if it had to keep moving. The road twisted and turned beneath him, each curve taking him deeper into the unknown, deeper into a nightmare he couldn't escape. He tried again to slow down, to pull off the road, but the truck didn't respond. It wasn't his decision anymore. The road controlled everything. The truck, the gas pedal, the turning wheel. His body trembled as he realized. He wasn't in charge. He hadn't been for a long time. The road was a living, breathing entity, a force that fed on him, on everyone who drove through it. It had taken him, just like it had taken everyone else. And now, he was part of it. His fingers were numb as they clutched the steering wheel, but it wasn't the cold air or the fear that made them shake. It was the weight of the truth, the suffocating knowledge that he would never leave. The road would never let him go. The figure in the rearview mirror grinned again. Mark couldn't look away. He didn't want to look away. His reflection was too familiar, too twisted, as if he were looking into a version of himself that had been hollowed out, consumed, until there was nothing left but an empty shell. His own voice echoed through his mind, cold and taunting, like it had been there all along. waiting to speak the truth. You can't escape. The fog grew thicker, the mist swirling around the truck like an angry beast, closing in from all directions. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, the road stretching before him like an unending abyss, a tunnel with no end. "This isn't real," he whispered, but the words felt empty, useless. His throat burned. I'm not part of this. I'm not part of you." But the road didn't listen. It never had. He couldn't see anything ahead. The headlights flickered and dimmed, but there was no light at the end of the road. There was only darkness. And then he heard it, the faintest sound at first, like whispers in the distance. But then it grew louder, louder until it was deafening. The voices, hundreds of them, all speaking at once, filling the air, crashing into his mind, smothering him. "You are part of it now. You belong to the road." Mark's pulse quickened. He slammed his hands against the wheel in desperation, but the voices didn't stop. They kept coming, faster, more frantic, until it felt like his mind was being torn apart. He gritted his teeth, his knuckles white against the wheel. The road shifted beneath him, the asphalt warping, twisting like a living creature. The trucks, the ones that had been chasing him, had appeared again. But they weren't just behind him anymore. They were around him. The headlights glared through the fog, their engines roaring like thunder. Mark's breath was shallow, his heart pounding in his throat as the trucks encircled him, their engines growling louder, their headlights blinding him from every direction. There was nowhere to go, no escape. They were closing in, their headlights flickering like the eyes of predators. And then everything stopped. The trucks, the fog, the sound of the engines. It was all gone, swallowed by the silence. Mark sat in the truck, his body frozen, his mind reeling. The road stretched ahead, still and quiet. It was just him now. No trucks, no figures, no voices. Just an endless stretch of black road, stretching on into the night, the horizon empty. But then, in the distance, he saw it. A light, faint at first, but it grew brighter, closer. It was the first light he'd seen in what felt like forever. It was real. Mark's chest tightened with hope. He wasn't sure where it was coming from, but it didn't matter. He could leave. He could finally escape. His hands shook as he reached for the gear shift, but as he touched it, the road beneath him rumbled, the ground vibrated, the truck shuddering violently. And then the voice came again. "You can't leave." The light ahead grew brighter, but it wasn't a beacon. It wasn't a way out. It was the end of the road. Mark's foot slammed on the gas, but the truck didn't respond. The road didn't respond. The light in the distance came closer, but it was no longer a way to escape. It was the road's final destination. The truck slammed into it. The world went dark.